This debate between the quantitative scholars and the qualitative scholars is increasingly headed towards the view that mixed methods that combine the quantitative and the qualitative are the best way to deal with, best way to understand, best way to probe the nature of conflict. And why is that view becoming dominant? What quantitative studies do, which I've done, which lots of other people have done, which is how economics typically studies conflict, right? And also a lot of political science. What quantitative study does is quantitative studies does two things quite well. One, it establishes patterns of how is the violence distributed, what is the kind of violence which is taking place in one place, and how is it different from another place. What are the patterns across space, what are the patterns across time. All of that let's call it identification of patterns. That's one great contribution that a large N study can make. The second great contribution it makes is establishing correlations. So the large scale, the distribution of violence, right? You can think about it as violence as the dependent variable, and then you can think of some other variables which could be possibly be listed as independent variables. So violence could be connected with some economic magnitudes, violence could be connected with some political phenomena, violence could be connected with some relationships, social relationships or civic relationships, etc. Right? So a quantitative study will also be very good at establishing the correlations, but quantitative studies, even in their best forms, are unable to sort out causality in a plausible, meaningful, convincing manner. Correlations we know are not causalities. There are ways in which you handle causality in quantitative studies, but even in the best versions of quantitative work, what you get is the effect of X over Y. The causal effect of, let's say, when you've established causality, when you say X is really the cause of Y, the effect of X over Y you can establish if you try very hard under certain conditions. It's possible to do so, right? And those are rare conditions. But even if you establish those effects, right, plausibly, meaningfully, convincingly, right, the fact remains that you won't be able to establish causal mechanisms. You need to draw a distinction between causal mechanisms and causal effects. X had a causal effect on Y can be established under certain conditions in quantitative work, but through what mechanisms X had an effect on Y? For that, qualitative work still remains one of the best ways to probe, to research, to establish the mechanisms through which X has an effect on Y, right? And that requires basically understanding the process very well, what led to what, in what way. And if you want to do this, what led to what in what way, you can't understand this problem, or you can't even structure this research problem very well in a large and quantitative way. You need to get down to some appropriately, methodologically, carefully chosen case studies. Not any cases, appropriately chosen, methodologically justified cases which flow from your large N work, right? Which then establish why X might be related to Y, and sometimes whether X is related to Y in a causal way. Even that requires, in-depth qualitative work. And that's why increasingly scholars are coming around to the view that both quantitative and qualitative work is necessary to understand the causes of conflict well.